The message came at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, just as I was settling into bed with a cup of chamomile tea and a good book. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't heard from in 8 months. Ryan, my ex-boyfriend. The words on the screen made my blood run cold. Just thought you should know, I'm marrying Jess tomorrow. Vegas wedding. Thanks for introducing us, babe. Couldn't have found my soulmate without you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria, and at 31, I thought I had my life figured out. I work as a senior graphic designer at a boutique marketing firm in Denver, Colorado, own a cozy townhouse in the suburbs, and have what most people would consider a solid friend group. What I didn't have anymore was a boyfriend, and honestly, after what Ryan put me through, I was perfectly fine with that arrangement. Ryan and I dated for 2.5 years. We met at a coffee shop near my office where he worked as a barista while supposedly finishing his business degree. He was charming in that effortless way some men have, quick with a joke, always knew the right thing to say, and had this infectious laugh that could light up a room. For the first year, everything felt perfect. He would surprise me with my favorite pastries, remember small details about my day, and seemed genuinely interested in building a future together. The cracks started showing during our second year together. Ryan's shifts at the coffee shop became more sporadic, and he kept pushing back his graduation date. When I asked about his classes, he would get defensive, saying I didn't understand the pressure he was under. He started staying out late with friends I'd never met, claiming he needed space to figure things out. The sweet texts throughout the day became fewer, and our weekend plans often got canceled last minute because something more interesting came up. The final straw came last Christmas when I caught him in a lie about where he'd been the night before. He claimed he was at his brother's place helping with home repairs, but his brother called looking for him that same evening. When I confronted Ryan about it, he exploded. He accused me of being controlling, of not trusting him, of being the reason he felt suffocated in our relationship. The fight was brutal, with him saying things that cut deep about my career, my personality, even my appearance. We broke up 2 days after New Year's, and honestly, it was a relief. The constant anxiety of wondering where I stood with him, the walking on eggshells to avoid another fight, the feeling like I was always auditioning to be worthy of his time, all of it just disappeared. I threw myself into work, started taking pottery classes, and began rebuilding my sense of self that had somehow gotten lost in trying to make Ryan happy. That's where Jessica came in. Jess had been my best friend since college, the kind of friend who knew all your secrets, who would drop everything to help you move, who remembered your coffee order and your mother's birthday. She was a kindergarten teacher with the biggest heart and the most infectious laugh. When Ryan and I broke up, she was there with wine, tissues, and all the right words to help me process what had happened. Jess had recently gone through her own breakup with a long-term boyfriend named Marcus, so we spent a lot of evenings that winter commiserating over our failed relationships and planning our fabulous single lives. She would come over after work, and we would cook dinner together, watch terrible reality TV, and talk about everything and nothing. Those months of healing were made so much easier by having her unwavering support. I should have seen the signs, but hindsight is always perfect, isn't it? In March, Jess started mentioning Ryan casually in conversation. She would ask how I was feeling about the breakup, if I missed him, whether I thought I might ever get back together. At first, I assumed she was just being a good friend, checking in on my emotional state. Then she started running into him places, at the grocery store, at the gym, at various coffee shops around town. Denver isn't that small of a city, so it struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it. By April, the questions had shifted. She wanted to know if I would be okay if she happened to run into Ryan at social events, whether it would bother me if they ended up in the same friend groups, how I would feel if she had to interact with him professionally. I assured her that I was completely over him and that she shouldn't worry about my feelings when it came to any accidental encounters. I genuinely meant it, too. At that point, I felt nothing but indifference toward Ryan and was grateful to be free of the drama he brought to my life. The first real warning sign came in early May. Jess and I had plans for our monthly girls' night, something we'd been doing religiously for 3 years. She canceled last minute, claiming she had food poisoning. I offered to come over with soup and medicine, but she insisted she just needed to sleep it off. 2 days later, I saw social media posts from mutual friends showing a group dinner at a trendy restaurant downtown. In one of the background photos, I could swear I saw Jess at a table with someone who looked suspiciously like Ryan, but the image was blurry, and I convinced myself I was imagining things. More cancellations followed. Suddenly, Jess was always busy when I suggested hanging out. She had lesson plans to write, family obligations, mysterious stomach bugs that seemed to strike every weekend. Our daily text conversations became sporadic, and when we did talk, she seemed distracted and evasive. I started to feel like I was losing my best friend, and I had no idea why. The truth hit me like a freight train in mid-June. I was at the farmer's market downtown, picking up flowers for my kitchen table, when I saw them. Ryan and Jess, walking hand in hand through the crowd, looking at each other the way people do when they're completely smitten. She was wearing a sundress I'd helped her pick out the month before, and he was carrying a bouquet of sunflowers, her favorite flower, something he must have learned about her during whatever courtship had been happening behind my back. I ducked behind a produce stand, my heart pounding as I watched them browse the various booths together. They looked comfortable, familiar, like they'd been doing this for months. Ryan kept leaning down to whisper things in her ear that made her giggle, and she had her hand tucked into the crook of his arm in that possessive way new couples do. At one point, he stopped to buy her a small potted herb plant, and the vendor made some comment about them being a lovely couple. They both beamed at the compliment. I left the market without buying anything, my hands shaking as I drove home. The betrayal felt worse than anything Ryan had done to me during our relationship. This wasn't just about him moving on. People break up and find new partners all the time. This was about my best friend, the person I trusted most in the world, carrying on a secret relationship with my ex-boyfriend while pretending to support me through our breakup. All those months of her asking how I was doing, whether I still had feelings for him, if I would be okay with various scenarios, she had been gathering intelligence, making sure the coast was clear for her to pursue him without losing me as a friend. That evening, I sat on my couch with a glass of wine, staring at my phone and trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to call Jess immediately and confront her about what I'd seen. Another part of me wanted to pretend I'd never seen them together and wait to see if she would eventually tell me the truth. But the biggest part of me felt like I'd been punched in the gut, betrayed by the two people who should have had my back. I decided to wait and see how long they would keep up the charade. Maybe they were planning to tell me soon, and I was overreacting to what might have been a very new development. Maybe there was some explanation I hadn't considered. Deep down, though, I knew what I had witnessed was not a first date or a chance encounter that had turned romantic. They had been too comfortable, too in sync, too familiar with each other's preferences and habits. The waiting was torture. Every time Jess texted me, I analyzed her words for hidden meanings. Every social media post I saw from mutual friends made me search the backgrounds for signs of Ryan and Jess together. I started declining invitations to group events, afraid of accidentally witnessing more of their secret romance, or worse, having them show up together and having to pretend I didn't know. July brought my birthday, and Jess insisted on throwing me a party at her apartment. I almost said no, but I was curious to see how she would handle the situation. Would she invite Ryan? Would she find some excuse to leave early to see him? Would she be checking her phone constantly, waiting for his texts? As it turned out, she was the perfect hostess and attentive friend that night, but I noticed she kept her phone face down on the counter and seemed almost relieved when the last guest left. August was when the lies became more elaborate. Jess started mentioning a new guy she was seeing, someone she called David from her yoga class. She would reference their dates when explaining why she couldn't hang out, and she even showed me a photo of flowers he had supposedly sent her. The flowers looked suspiciously like ones I'd seen Ryan bring to past girlfriends, and the note that came with them had handwriting that looked familiar, though I couldn't quite place it. September brought the biggest lie of all. Jess told me that David had proposed during a weekend trip to Aspen, and she was engaged. She showed me a modest diamond ring and talked about their plans for a small, intimate wedding. She said David was camera shy and preferred to keep their relationship private, which is why I hadn't met him yet. She promised I would be her maid of honor and that we would start planning the wedding soon.
I felt sick listening to her spin this elaborate fiction. But I still had no concrete proof that David was actually Ryan. The ring could have come from anyone, and I only seen them together that once at the farmer's market. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe my hurt feelings about her pulling away from our friendship had made me paranoid and suspicious. Maybe she really had found love with someone new, and I was being a terrible friend by doubting her happiness. October proved me wrong in the most brutal way possible. I was having lunch at a small cafe near my office when I overheard a conversation at the table behind me. Two women were discussing a mutual friend's upcoming wedding, and one of them mentioned that the bride was a kindergarten teacher named Jessica who was marrying a guy named Ryan whom she had stolen from her best friend. They talked about how romantic the proposal had been in Aspen and how the couple was planning a surprise wedding in Vegas to avoid drama from the ex-girlfriend. My appetite disappeared as I realized they were talking about my Jessica and my Ryan. The elaborate story about David from yoga class was a complete fabrication. They were planning to get married without telling me, probably assuming I would find out after the fact when it was too late to object or cause problems. The level of deception was staggering, and I felt like I'd been living in some alternate reality where my best friend and ex-boyfriend were conducting an elaborate con game against me. I paid for my untouched salad and walked back to my office in a daze. 8 months of lies, 8 months of pretending to care about my healing while secretly planning a future with the man who had broken my heart. 8 months of me supporting her through what I thought was her own journey of self-discovery after her breakup with Marcus. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I couldn't even process the full extent of it. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I hired a private investigator. It sounds extreme, but I needed to know the truth before I confronted either of them. If I was wrong, I would look like a jealous, paranoid ex-girlfriend. If I was right, I wanted to have all the facts before I decided how to handle the situation. The investigator, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who came highly recommended, was incredibly thorough. Within a week, she had traced Ryan and Jess's relationship back to February, just 6 weeks after my breakup with him. She had photos of them together at restaurants, hotels, shopping centers, and various events around the city. She had documentation of Ryan staying overnight at Jess's apartment multiple times per week since March. She even had evidence that they had been texting and calling each other during the final weeks of my relationship with Ryan, suggesting that their connection had begun before we had officially broken up. The most damning evidence was a series of social media posts that Jess had made private, but that Patricia had managed to access through professional means. Photos of her and Ryan on romantic dates, vacation pictures from their trip to Aspen where he had proposed, and even a few posts where she referred to him as her soulmate and talked about how fate had brought them together. The dates on these posts proved that she had been lying to me for months while documenting their entire relationship online for other people to see. Patricia also discovered that Ryan had never actually been enrolled in any business degree program, confirming my suspicions that he had been lying about school during our relationship too. He had been working various part-time jobs, but telling different stories to different people about his career goals and educational status. The man I had dated for 2.5 years and who was now engaged to my best friend was apparently a compulsive liar who had built his entire persona on deception. Armed with this information, I had to decide how to proceed. I could confront them directly, but what would that accomplish? They were clearly committed to their relationship and their web of lies. I could expose them to our mutual friends, but that felt petty and would probably backfire by making me look vindictive. I could simply cut them both out of my life and move on, but that meant they would get to continue their fairy tale romance without any consequences for the pain they had caused me.
The solution came to me in November, just as Patricia was wrapping up her investigation. She mentioned that she had been able to identify Ryan's real name through public records. Apparently, he had been using a nickname with most people, including me. His legal name was Ryan David Thornfield, which explained the David persona Jess had created for her fake boyfriend. But more importantly, Patricia had found something interesting about Jess's family that she thought I should know. Jess's father, Robert Morrison, was a prominent attorney in Denver who specialized in family law and had a reputation for being extremely protective of his daughter. He was also, according to Patricia's research, the kind of man who would not take kindly to discovering that his future son-in-law was a liar who had built his relationship with his daughter on deception and betrayal. Robert Morrison had strong opinions about integrity and honesty, values that he had instilled in his daughter and that he expected from anyone who wanted to be part of his family. The plan that formed in my mind was poetic in its justice. If Ryan wanted to marry Jess based on lies, and if Jess wanted to build her marriage on the foundation of betraying her best friend, then perhaps her father deserved to know exactly what kind of man he was welcoming into his family, and what kind of person his daughter had become in the process of landing her dream guy. I spent weeks crafting the perfect approach. I didn't want to come across as a bitter ex-girlfriend trying to sabotage their happiness out of jealousy. I wanted to present the facts in a way that would allow Robert Morrison to make his own informed decisions about his daughter's choices and her fiancé's character. Patricia helped me organize the evidence into a clear timeline that showed the progression of Ryan and Jess's relationship alongside the elaborate deception they had constructed to hide it from me. The package I prepared for Robert Morrison included copies of the text messages and social media posts that proved the timeline of their relationship, photos documenting their secret dates and romantic getaways, evidence of Ryan's lies about his educational background, and a detailed letter explaining how Jess had used our friendship to gather information that would help her pursue my ex-boyfriend without facing any consequences for her actions. I also included character references for myself, letters from mutual acquaintances who could vouch for my integrity and confirm that I was not the type of person to make false accusations out of spite. I wanted Robert Morrison to understand that I was bringing this information to him not because I wanted to destroy his daughter's happiness, but because I believed he deserved to know the truth about the man she was planning to marry and the methods she had used to secure that relationship. The letter to Robert Morrison was the hardest part to write. I wanted to strike the right tone, concerned rather than vindictive, factual rather than emotional, respectful rather than accusatory. I explained who I was, how I knew his daughter, and why I felt compelled to share this information with him despite the personal cost of doing so. I made it clear that I had no desire to hurt Jess, but that I could not in good conscience allow her to marry someone under false pretenses without at least giving her family the opportunity to make informed decisions about their support. I mailed the package to Robert Morrison's law office on a Friday afternoon in late November, timing it so that he would receive it on Monday morning when he would have time to review everything thoroughly before making any decisions about how to proceed. I included my contact information in case he wanted to verify any of the details or ask follow-up questions, but I made it clear that I expected nothing from him and would respect whatever decision he made about how to handle the situation. The waiting was excruciating. I had no idea how Robert Morrison would react to the information I had provided, or whether he would take any action at all. For all I knew, he might decide that his daughter's happiness was more important than the methods she had used to achieve it, or that Ryan's lies were not serious enough to warrant interfering with their wedding plans. I had done what I felt was right, but I had no control over the outcome. What I didn't expect was the text message that arrived 2 weeks later, the same message I mentioned at the beginning of this story. Ryan, presumably unaware that I had sent anything to Robert Morrison, decided to twist the knife one final time by informing me about his impending marriage to Jess and thanking me for introducing them. The smugness in his words, the casual cruelty of sending such a message late at night when he knew it would have maximum impact, and the complete lack of acknowledgement of the pain he had caused made my blood boil in a way I hadn't experienced since our original breakup. But this time, instead of being the victim of his manipulation, I had the power to respond in a way that would finally give him a taste of his own medicine. I screenshotted his text message and immediately forwarded it to Robert Morrison with a simple note. I thought you should see this. The timeline speaks for itself. Within 24 hours, my phone was ringing with a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a deep male voice introduced himself as Robert Morrison and asked if I had a few minutes to talk. His tone was serious but not hostile, and he thanked me for the information I had provided about his daughter's fiancé and their relationship. He confirmed that he had received Ryan's text message and that it had helped him understand the true character of the man his daughter was planning to marry. Robert Morrison told me that he had conducted his own investigation after receiving my initial package, hiring his own private investigator to verify the information I had provided and dig deeper into Ryan's background. What they had found was even worse than what I had discovered. Ryan had a history of similar relationships where he would target women who could provide him with financial or social benefits, pursue them with intense romantic attention, and then move on to new targets once he had extracted what he needed from the relationship. The investigator had also uncovered evidence that Ryan had been stealing money from his various employers over the years, using different names and identities to avoid detection when he moved from job to job. There were at least 3 other women in different cities who had similar stories about Ryan's deceptive behavior, and 2 of them had filed police reports for financial fraud after discovering that he had used their personal information to open credit accounts without their knowledge. Most shockingly, Robert Morrison told me that Ryan had been simultaneously engaged to another woman in Colorado Springs, a nurse named Sarah, whom he had been dating for almost as long as he had with Jess. The investigator had found evidence of Ryan maintaining separate social media accounts, different phone numbers, and elaborate scheduling systems to keep his multiple relationships from intersecting. He was essentially running a con game on multiple women at once, using each of them for different types of support while planning to marry whichever one offered him the best long-term prospects. The revelation about Ryan's multiple engagements hit me like a physical blow. As Robert Morrison continued speaking, I found myself gripping my phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Sarah, the nurse from Colorado Springs, had been planning her own wedding to Ryan for the same weekend that he was supposedly marrying Jess in Vegas. The level of deception was so staggering that I couldn't even process it fully at first. Robert Morrison's voice remained steady and professional as he outlined the evidence his investigator had uncovered. There were hotel receipts showing Ryan had been traveling between Denver and Colorado Springs regularly, maintaining 2 separate residences using different names. He had been telling Sarah that he worked in Denver as a business consultant, explaining his frequent absences as work trips. Meanwhile, he had been telling Jess that his family lived in Colorado Springs and that he visited them often to help with various family obligations. The financial fraud was even more extensive than I had imagined. Ryan had been using personal information from all his girlfriends to open credit cards, take out small loans, and even lease apartments that he would abandon once the bills started piling up. He had perfected the art of emotional manipulation, making each woman feel special and chosen while simultaneously convincing them to share personal details that he could exploit later. Sarah, according to Robert Morrison's investigator, had been supporting Ryan financially for months, believing that he was between jobs due to a family emergency. She had been paying for his apartment, his car payments, and even his wedding ring, thinking that she was helping her future husband through a temporary rough patch. Just like Jess had been paying for their romantic dinners and weekend getaways, believing that Ryan was saving money for their future together. The investigator had also discovered that Ryan's real name wasn't even Ryan Thornfield. His legal name was actually David Ryan Morse, and he had been using various combinations of his first, middle, and last names to create different identities for different relationships. The David that Jess had described to me wasn't entirely fictional. It was actually part of Ryan's real name, which he had cleverly incorporated into his fake persona to make the lies easier to remember. Robert Morrison explained that he had already contacted Sarah in Colorado Springs and shared some of the evidence with her. She had been devastated to learn about Jess and the other women, but she had also been relieved to finally understand why certain aspects of her relationship with Ryan had never quite made sense. She had been planning to confront him that weekend, but Robert Morrison had convinced her to wait until he could coordinate a more comprehensive response. As I listened to all of this information, I felt a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in knowing that my instincts about Ryan had been correct, that the uneasiness I had felt throughout our relationship had been justified. There was also guilt about Jess, who I realized was as much a victim of Ryan's manipulation as I had been, even though her betrayal of our friendship still stung deeply.
But mostly, I felt a growing sense of anticipation about what would happen when Ryan's carefully constructed web of lies finally collapsed around him. Robert Morrison asked if I would be willing to coordinate with him and Sarah to ensure that Ryan's deception was exposed in a way that would prevent him from simply moving on to new victims. He explained that his daughter Jess was still unaware of most of what they had discovered, though he had begun asking her subtle questions about her fiancé that had made her defensive and suspicious. He wanted to handle the situation delicately to minimize the emotional damage to Jess while ensuring that Ryan faced real consequences for his actions. I agreed immediately. After months of feeling helpless and betrayed, the opportunity to take meaningful action against someone who had caused so much pain was incredibly appealing. Robert Morrison suggested that we meet in person to plan our approach, and we scheduled a coffee meeting for the following afternoon at a cafe downtown that was far from both Jess's neighborhood and my usual haunts. Meeting Robert Morrison in person was intimidating at first. He was exactly what I had expected from a successful attorney. Tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and radiating the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of handling difficult situations. But his manner was warm and genuinely concerned, and it was clear that his primary motivation was protecting his daughter from further harm rather than seeking revenge against Ryan. He showed me additional evidence that his investigator had gathered, including financial records that demonstrated the scope of Ryan's fraud. The man had been living entirely off money stolen or manipulated from various women for at least 3 years, possibly longer. He had no legitimate income, no real address, and no actual intention of settling down with any of the women he was deceiving. His pattern was to maintain multiple relationships simultaneously until one of them became too expensive or complicated to manage, at which point he would create some crisis that allowed him to disappear and focus on his remaining targets. Robert Morrison had also discovered that Ryan had a criminal record in another state under his real name, including charges for fraud and identity theft that had been pleaded down to misdemeanors. He had been arrested twice for writing bad checks and once for using a fake identity to lease an apartment. The pattern of deception stretched back years, suggesting that his relationship with me had been part of a long-term criminal enterprise rather than just typical dating drama. We spent 2 hours planning our approach. Robert Morrison wanted to gather all the victims together and present Ryan with undeniable evidence of his crimes, forcing him to choose between facing legal consequences or leaving town permanently and never contacting any of us again. He believed that public humiliation and the threat of prosecution would be more effective than simply exposing Ryan to each woman individually, since he had proven so skilled at manipulating people even when confronted with evidence of his lies. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Sarah would text Ryan suggesting they meet for an early dinner before their planned Vegas trip, but she would actually bring him to a private dining room that Robert Morrison had reserved at an upscale restaurant downtown. Jess would be told that her father wanted to host an engagement dinner for her and Ryan, bringing her to the same location under different pretenses.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I would be there as well, along with Robert Morrison, his investigator, and a representative from the district attorney's office who specialized in fraud cases. When Ryan arrived expecting a romantic dinner with Sarah, he would instead find himself facing all of his victims simultaneously, with documentation of his crimes spread across the table and law enforcement ready to take action. He would be given a choice: face immediate arrest and prosecution, or sign legal documents admitting to his fraud, agree to pay restitution to his victims, and leave Colorado permanently with the understanding that any future contact with any of us would result in immediate criminal charges. The plan required precise timing and coordination, but Robert Morrison's legal experience had taught him how to manage complex situations involving multiple parties with competing interests. He would handle the legal aspects and coordinate with law enforcement, while I would be responsible for ensuring that Sarah understood her role and was prepared for the emotional confrontation. Jess would be the wild card, since we couldn't predict how she would react to learning the truth about her fiancé. Over the next week, I found myself in regular contact with both Robert Morrison and Sarah as we refined our plan and prepared for the confrontation. Sarah turned out to be a thoughtful, intelligent woman who had been completely taken in by Ryan's charm and manipulation. She had genuinely believed that she was engaged to a successful businessman who was going through temporary financial difficulties, and she had been happy to support him through what she thought was a rough patch in his career. Sarah's story was heartbreakingly similar to mine, though her relationship with Ryan had progressed more quickly toward financial dependency. He had moved in with her after just 3 months of dating, claiming that his lease had expired unexpectedly and he needed a temporary place to stay while he found something new. 6 months later, he was still living in her apartment rent-free while she paid for groceries, utilities, and even his car insurance. She had been planning their Vegas wedding for weeks, excited about starting their life together and looking forward to the stability that marriage would bring to their relationship. She had taken time off work, arranged for pet care, and even bought a new dress for the ceremony. The discovery that her entire relationship had been built on lies had shattered her trust in her own judgment as much as it had broken her heart. Like me, Sarah had noticed inconsistencies in Ryan's stories and behavior, but she had rationalized them away because she wanted to believe in their relationship. He was often unreachable during certain hours of the day, claiming he was in meetings or dealing with family emergencies. His explanations for his financial situation never quite added up, and he was vague about details of his work and his background. But he was so attentive and affectionate when they were together that she had convinced herself that these red flags were just signs of temporary stress rather than evidence of deeper deception. The most painful part of Sarah's story was how Ryan had used her compassion against her. He would create elaborate stories about family crises that required him to travel or be unreachable, playing on her natural desire to be supportive and understanding. He had told her that his parents were dealing with serious health issues, that his sister was going through a difficult divorce, that his brother had lost his job and needed financial help. Sarah had not only believed these stories, but had also offered to contribute money to help his family, money that had obviously gone towards supporting his other relationships. As we prepared for the confrontation, Sarah confided that part of her was relieved to finally have an explanation for all the things that had never made sense about their relationship. The constant financial stress, the mysterious absences, the way he seemed to compartmentalize different aspects of his life, all of it finally made sense in the context of his deception. She had been blaming herself for months, wondering why she couldn't seem to make their relationship work despite our best efforts. Robert Morrison was handling his daughter's situation with impressive restraint. He had begun asking Jess subtle questions about Ryan's background and their wedding plans, trying to gauge how much she actually knew about the man she was planning to marry. Her answers revealed that she, like Sarah and me, had been accepting Ryan's explanations for various inconsistencies without digging deeper into the details. Jess had told her father that Ryan was a private person who didn't like to talk much about his past, which had made her feel special when he did share personal details with her. She had interpreted his secretiveness as evidence of their deep emotional connection rather than recognizing it as a red flag. She had also mentioned that Ryan preferred to keep their relationship somewhat private on social media and in public, which she had found romantic and mature compared to couples who felt the need to document every moment of their relationship online. The irony, of course, was that Ryan's desire for privacy had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with avoiding detection by his other girlfriends. His careful management of his social media presence and public appearances was part of an elaborate system designed to keep his multiple relationships from intersecting. What Jess had interpreted as romantic discretion was actually criminal-level operational security. Robert Morrison was also dealing with his own feelings of guilt about his daughter's situation. He had liked Ryan during their limited interactions, finding him charming and apparently devoted to Jess. He had even helped Ryan pick out an engagement ring, believing that he was supporting his daughter's happiness. The discovery that he had been unknowingly enabling a con artist had been a blow to his professional pride as well as his paternal instincts. As the date of our planned confrontation approached, I found myself experiencing a range of emotions that I hadn't expected. There was definitely satisfaction at the prospect of seeing Ryan face consequences for his actions, but there was also anxiety about how the situation would affect Jess and Sarah. Both women were innocent victims of Ryan's manipulation, and I knew that learning the truth would be devastating for them regardless of how carefully we handled the revelation. I also had to confront my own motivations for participating in this plan. Was I doing this to protect other potential victims, or was I seeking revenge against Ryan and Jess for the pain they had caused me?
The line between justice and vengeance felt uncomfortably thin, especially when I thought about how humiliated Jess would be when she learned that her father had been investigating her fiancé and coordinating with his ex-girlfriend.
But every time I wavered in my resolve, I would remember Ryan's text message about marrying my best friend and thanking me for introducing them. The casual cruelty of that message, sent at a time when he thought he was getting away with everything, reminded me that he had shown no remorse for the pain he had caused and would continue causing new victims if he wasn't stopped. The final piece of our plan fell into place when Robert Morrison's investigator discovered that Ryan had been planning to disappear immediately after his Vegas wedding to Jess. He had been liquidating small assets, closing bank accounts, and preparing to leave Colorado entirely. The investigator believed that Ryan had been using his engagement to Jess as a cover while he prepared to move on to a new city and new victims, possibly taking whatever money he could steal from her in the process. This discovery convinced me that we were doing the right thing. Ryan wasn't just a garden-variety cheater or even a typical con artist. He was a predator who had perfected the art of emotional and financial manipulation, and he was actively planning to escalate his crimes. If we didn't stop him now, there would be more victims in the future, women who would go through the same pain and betrayal that Sarah, Jess, and I had experienced. The night before our planned confrontation, I couldn't sleep. I kept running through various scenarios in my mind, trying to anticipate how Ryan would react when faced with undeniable evidence of his deception. Would he try to charm his way out of the situation, as he had done so many times before? Would he become aggressive or threatening? Would he simply try to leave? Or would he attempt to manipulate one of his victims into believing that the others were lying? I also worried about Jess and how she would handle learning the truth about both her fiancé and her father's investigation. She had been my best friend for years before Ryan came between us, and despite her betrayal, I didn't want to see her humiliated or broken by the experience. I hoped that she would eventually understand that we were trying to protect her from a much worse fate, but I knew that she might never forgive any of us for exposing her relationship in such a dramatic way. Sarah called me around midnight, unable to sleep as well. She confessed that she was terrified about facing Ryan the next day, but she was also determined to see it through. She had spent months feeling confused and inadequate in their relationship, blaming herself for their problems and trying harder to be the perfect girlfriend. Learning that none of their issues had been her fault had been liberating, but it had also made her angry in a way she had never experienced before. We talked for over an hour about what we hoped to accomplish and what we feared might go wrong. Both of us acknowledged that there was no guarantee Ryan would accept our ultimatum or that the legal consequences would be severe enough to prevent him from simply moving to a new city and starting over with fresh victims. But we agreed that doing nothing was not an option, especially knowing what we now knew about the scope of his deception. The morning of the confrontation, I woke up early and spent extra time getting ready, choosing an outfit that would make me feel confident and professional rather than emotional or vindictive. I wanted to be seen as a credible witness rather than a bitter ex-girlfriend, so I opted for a conservative dress and minimal jewelry. I practiced what I would say in the mirror, focusing on facts rather than feelings, and trying to anticipate Ryan's possible responses. Robert Morrison had arranged for us to meet at his law office an hour before our reservation at the restaurant, so we could review our plan one final time and make sure everyone understood their role. When I arrived, Sarah was already there, looking nervous but determined. She had brought copies of financial documents that showed how much money she had spent supporting Ryan, as well as text messages that demonstrated his lies about his work and family situation. The district attorney's representative, a sharp woman in her 40s named Janet Walsh, explained the legal aspects of what we were attempting. She confirmed that Ryan's actions constituted criminal fraud in multiple jurisdictions, and that there was enough evidence to pursue prosecution if he refused to cooperate. However, she also warned us that white-collar crimes like fraud often resulted in relatively light sentences, especially for first-time offenders in Colorado, and that Ryan might be willing to risk prosecution rather than accept our terms. Janet Walsh also explained that our approach, while legally sound, was ethically complex because it involved an element of deception in getting Ryan to the restaurant. She assured us that nothing we were planning would jeopardize a potential criminal case,
but she warned that Ryan's lawyer would likely argue that he had been ambushed and coerced into any agreement he might sign. The key was to make sure that everything we did was documented and that Ryan clearly understood his options before making any decisions. At exactly 5:30, we left the law office and drove separately to the restaurant. Robert Morrison had chosen an upscale Italian place downtown that had private dining rooms available for business meetings. The room he had reserved was elegant but not intimate, with a large table that could accommodate all of us comfortably and enough space for Janet Walsh to set up her recording equipment discreetly. I arrived first and helped Robert Morrison arrange the evidence on the table in a way that would be immediately visible to Ryan when he entered the room. There were printed copies of social media posts, financial records, hotel receipts, and photographs that documented his relationships with multiple women. Janet Walsh set up a small digital recorder and explained that Colorado law allowed for recording as long as one party to the conversation consented, which Robert Morrison would provide. Sarah arrived exactly on time, looking pale but composed. She had texted Ryan earlier to confirm their dinner plans, and he had responded enthusiastically, apparently excited about their upcoming Vegas trip. She showed us his response, which was full of heart emojis and promises about their wonderful future together.
Reading his manipulative messages while surrounded by evidence of his crimes felt surreal, like watching a movie about someone else's life. Jess arrived 10 minutes later, looking beautiful and happy in a way that made my chest tighten with both nostalgia and guilt. She was wearing the same perfume she had worn since college, and her hair was styled the way I remembered from our countless girls' nights together. She greeted her father warmly and seemed genuinely excited about the engagement dinner he had supposedly planned for her and Ryan. When Jess saw me sitting at the table, her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally a growing wariness that suggested she was beginning to sense that something was not what it seemed. She looked back and forth between her father and me, clearly trying to understand why I would be at her engagement dinner, given the current state of our friendship. Robert Morrison handled the situation with professional skill, explaining to Jess that there were some things about Ryan that she needed to know before her wedding, and that I was there because I had information that was relevant to her safety and well-being. He kept his tone calm and reassuring, but firm enough to make it clear that this was not a social dinner. Jess's confusion turned to alarm as she took in the formal setup of the room, the recording equipment, and the stacks of documents spread across the table. She demanded to know what was going on and why I was involved in what was supposed to be a family celebration. Her voice carried a note of panic that made me feel genuinely sorry for her, despite everything that had happened between us. Before Robert Morrison could explain further, Ryan arrived. He walked into the private dining room expecting to find Sarah waiting for him, but instead, he found himself facing a table full of people who were clearly not there for a romantic dinner. His face went through its own series of expressions as he processed the situation: confusion, recognition, calculation, and finally a careful mask of charm that I remembered well from our relationship. Ryan's first instinct was to try to control the narrative through humor and misdirection. He made jokes about the unexpected party and complimented everyone on their appearance, acting as though this was a delightful surprise rather than a confrontation. He moved toward Jess as if to kiss her hello, but she stepped back instinctively, clearly sensing the tension in the room even if she didn't understand its source yet. Robert Morrison took control of the situation immediately, asking Ryan to take a seat and explaining that there were serious matters that needed to be discussed before any weddings took place. His tone was professional but unmistakably authoritative, and Ryan's casual facade began to crack as he realized that his usual charm tactics were not going to work in this setting. The moment when Ryan saw the evidence spread across the table was something I will never forget. His face went completely blank for just an instant before his eyes began moving rapidly across the documents, clearly recognizing photos and records that he knew would be impossible to explain away. I watched him calculate his options in real time, weighing whether to try denial, aggression, or some other form of manipulation. Sarah spoke first, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. She asked Ryan directly how long he had been engaged to Jess and whether their own engagement had ever been real or just another part of his con game. Her question cut through all the potential deflections and forced Ryan to confront the central fact of his deception.
that he had been simultaneously engaged to multiple women while lying to all of them about his identity and intentions. Ryan's response was exactly what I had expected from someone who had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation. He immediately tried to make Sarah feel guilty for doubting him, claiming that he could explain everything if she would just give him a chance. He reached for her hand across the table, using the same tender voice I remembered from our own relationship, and began weaving a story about how complicated his life had become and how much he loved her despite the misunderstandings. But Janet Walsh cut him off before he could gain any momentum with his explanations. She identified herself as a representative of the district attorney's office and informed Ryan that he was facing potential criminal charges for fraud, identity theft, and financial crimes in multiple jurisdictions. She explained that the evidence against him was substantial and that his best option was to cooperate fully with their investigation. The transformation in Ryan was immediate and dramatic. The charming, apologetic boyfriend disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating who clearly understood that his usual tactics would not work in this setting. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, studying each of us as though we were opponents in a chess game rather than people he had claimed to love. Jess finally found her voice, demanding to know what crimes Ryan was supposed to have committed and why no one had told her about any investigation into her fiancé. Her father gently explained that he had hired a private investigator after receiving disturbing information about Ryan's background, and that what they had discovered was far worse than anyone had initially suspected. When Robert Morrison began reading from the investigator's report, detailing Ryan's multiple identities, his criminal record, and his simultaneous relationships with several women, Jess's face went white. She kept shaking her head as though she could make the information untrue through sheer force of will. And she looked at Ryan with a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope that he would somehow prove all of these accusations wrong. Ryan's strategy became clear as he began to speak. Rather than denying the evidence outright, he tried to minimize its significance and shift blame to his accusers. He claimed that his relationships with other women had been casual and meaningless, that he had only gotten involved with them because he was confused about his feelings for Jess. He portrayed himself as someone who had made mistakes, but who genuinely loved Jess and wanted to build a real life with her. The performance was masterful in its way, hitting all the right emotional notes to make Jess want to believe him, while simultaneously suggesting that the rest of us were motivated by jealousy and vindictiveness. He apologized tearfully for his deception, while insisting that his feelings for Jess were real, and he begged her not to let other people destroy their chance at happiness together. For a moment, I thought his manipulation might actually work.
Jess was clearly torn between the evidence in front of her and her desire to believe that her relationship had been real. She looked at Ryan with the same expression I remembered having during the worst moments of our own relationship, desperate to trust someone who had proven themselves untrustworthy, hoping against hope that love would be enough to overcome the obvious red flags. But then Janet Walsh produced the final piece of evidence that Robert Morrison's investigator had uncovered. Ryan had been married twice before, under different names, and both marriages had ended when his wives discovered his financial fraud and infidelity. There were court records showing that he had been ordered to pay restitution to previous victims, and that he had simply disappeared rather than comply with those orders. The revelation that Ryan was not just a cheater or even a bigamist, but someone who had been running the same con for years with multiple victims finally broke through Jess's emotional defenses. She looked at him with growing horror as she realized that nothing about their relationship had been real. Not his name, not his background, not even his legal availability to marry her. Sarah was crying openly now, mourning not just the loss of her relationship, but the destruction of her faith in her own judgment. She had supported this man financially and emotionally for months, believing that she was helping someone she loved through a difficult time. Learning that every moment of tenderness, every shared confidence, every promise about their future had been calculated manipulation was devastating in a way that went far beyond simple heartbreak. Ryan made one final attempt to control the situation by standing up abruptly and announcing that he was leaving. He claimed that we had no legal authority to detain him and that he would not sit still for what he called a kangaroo court designed to humiliate him. He moved toward the door with the same confident stride I remembered from our relationship, clearly believing that he could simply walk away from this confrontation as he had walked away from so many others. But Janet Walsh was ready for this possibility. She calmly informed Ryan that there were police officers waiting outside the restaurant and that he could choose to leave with them in handcuffs, or he could sit back down and listen to the offer that Robert Morrison was prepared to make. She explained that the evidence against him was sufficient for immediate arrest and that his cooperation now would be his only opportunity to avoid prosecution. The sight of Ryan finally trapped, unable to charm or manipulate his way out of the consequences of his actions, was more satisfying than I had expected. For years, I had watched him lie his way out of problems, convince people to give him second chances, and move on to new victims without ever facing real accountability. Seeing him forced to confront the full scope of his crimes and the pain he had caused was a form of justice that felt almost too good to be true. Robert Morrison laid out the terms of their offer with the precision of an experienced attorney. Ryan would sign a full confession detailing his fraud against Sarah, Jess, and me, along with any other victims he was willing to acknowledge. He would agree to pay restitution for all money stolen or obtained through deception, with a payment plan that could be adjusted based on his actual ability to pay. He would leave Colorado immediately and agree never to contact any of his victims again, with the understanding that any future contact would result in immediate prosecution. In exchange for this cooperation, the district attorney's office would defer prosecution as long as Ryan complied with all terms of the agreement. If he failed to make restitution payments, contacted any of his victims, or was arrested for similar crimes in any other jurisdiction, he would face immediate prosecution in Colorado for all charges that could be supported by the evidence. The offer was generous, considering the scope of Ryan's crimes, but it was also designed to ensure that his victims would receive some compensation and that he would face ongoing consequences for his actions. Ryan's response to the offer revealed the calculating nature that had been hidden beneath his charming exterior throughout all of his relationships. He did not express remorse for the pain he had caused or gratitude for the opportunity to avoid prosecution. Instead, he immediately began negotiating the terms, trying to minimize the restitution amounts and the restrictions on his future behavior. His clinical approach to discussing the harm he had inflicted on multiple women was perhaps the most revealing aspect of his entire personality. He spoke about Sarah's financial losses and Jess's emotional trauma as though they were business expenses, inconvenient costs associated with his chosen lifestyle, rather than real damage inflicted on people who had trusted him with their hearts and their futures. Janet Walsh shut down his attempts at negotiation quickly, making it clear that the offer was non-negotiable and that his only choice was to accept the terms or face immediate arrest. She gave him 15 minutes to make his decision, during which time he was not allowed to leave the room or communicate with anyone outside. During those 15 minutes, Ryan sat in silence while the rest of us waited to see what he would choose. Jess stared at him as though she was seeing him clearly for the first time, her face cycling through emotions as she processed the full extent of his deception. Sarah wiped away tears while studying the financial documents that showed exactly how much money she had lost to his manipulation. I found myself thinking about all the times during our relationship when I had sensed that something was wrong, but had talked myself out of trusting my instincts. Ryan had been so skilled at making his lies seem reasonable, at making his victims feel like they were being paranoid or demanding when they questioned inconsistencies in his stories. The gaslighting had been so subtle and persistent that even now, surrounded by undeniable evidence of his crimes, part of me still felt guilty for having doubted him. When the 15 minutes were up, Ryan signed the confession and restitution agreement without ceremony. He did not apologize to any of his victims or acknowledge the pain he had caused. He simply signed the documents, accepted the copies that Janet Walsh provided, and asked when he needed to be out of Colorado. Robert Morrison informed him that he had 24 hours to pack his belongings and leave the state, and that he would be monitored to ensure compliance with all terms of the agreement. If he made any attempt to contact Jess, Sarah, or me during that time, or if he failed to leave Colorado as promised, he would be arrested immediately.
Ryan stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the door without looking at any of us. Just before he reached it, he turned back and delivered one final manipulation attempt, telling Jess that he was sorry she had let other people destroy what they had together, and that he hoped someday she would realize that their love had been real, even if nothing else was. The audacity of trying to gaslight Jess, even as he was signing a confession to defrauding her, was breathtaking in its cruelty. But Jess did not respond to his words or even look at him as he left the room. She sat staring at the table, processing the complete collapse of everything she had believed about her relationship and her future. After Ryan left, the four of us sat in stunned silence for several minutes. The confrontation had gone exactly according to plan, but the emotional aftermath was more complex than any of us had anticipated. We had successfully stopped a predator and ensured that his victims would receive some compensation for their losses, but we had also irrevocably changed the relationships between all of us in ways that would take time to understand. Sarah was the first to speak, thanking Robert Morrison and me for giving her the opportunity to confront Ryan with the truth about his deception. She said that she had been questioning her own sanity for months, unable to understand why their relationship felt so unstable despite her best efforts to make it work. Learning that none of their problems had been her fault was painful, but also liberating. Jess remained silent, clearly struggling to process everything she had learned about the man she had been planning to marry. Robert Morrison tried to comfort her, explaining that she had been the victim of an elaborate con game and that nothing about Ryan's deception was her fault. But I could see in her eyes that she was also grappling with guilt about her betrayal of our friendship, now understanding that the man she had chosen over me had never been worth that sacrifice. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Jess finally looked at me directly for the first time since Ryan had left. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked younger and more vulnerable than I had seen her since college. She opened her mouth as though she wanted to say something, but then closed it again, shaking her head slightly. I understood that she was not ready to address what had happened between us, and that was okay. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the personal relationships damaged by Ryan's manipulation would take much longer to heal, if they could be healed at all. For now, it was enough that we had prevented him from causing more harm and that his victims would receive some measure of justice. Robert Morrison offered to drive me home, and I accepted gratefully. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation was wearing off, leaving me exhausted and emotionally drained. As we sat in his car outside my townhouse, he thanked me again for bringing Ryan's crimes to his attention and potentially saving his daughter from a much worse fate. I asked him how he thought Jess would handle everything in the long term, and he admitted that he was not sure. She was strong and resilient, but the betrayal had been so complete and so public that it would take time for her to rebuild her confidence and trust in her own judgment. He was planning to suggest that she take some time off work and consider counseling to help her process what had happened. As I got out of Robert Morrison's car and walked toward my front door, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, relief, and sadness. Ryan would never be able to hurt me or anyone else in the same way again, and that felt like a significant victory. But the cost of that victory had been high, involving the exposure of painful secrets and the destruction of relationships that had once been important to all of us. That night, I poured myself a large glass of wine and sat on my couch, trying to process everything that had happened. The confrontation had been more emotionally intense than I had expected, and seeing Ryan's true character revealed so starkly had been both validating and disturbing. I felt vindicated in my decision to trust my instincts about him, but I also felt sadness for all the time and energy that had been wasted on someone who had never deserved any of it. I also found myself thinking about Jess and the friendship we had lost along the way. Seeing her so devastated and vulnerable had reminded me of why we had been close in the first place, and I wondered whether there might be a path toward reconciliation now that the truth about Ryan had been revealed. But I also knew that trust, once broken, was difficult to rebuild, and that she might never forgive me for the role I had played in exposing her relationship, even if that exposure had been necessary to protect her. The next few days passed quietly as I waited to hear whether Ryan would comply with the terms of his agreement. Janet Walsh called to confirm that he had indeed left Colorado as promised and that there had been no attempts to contact any of his victims.
Sarah sent me a text, thanking me again for my role in exposing the truth and mentioning that she was planning to move back to her hometown to be closer to family while she recovered from the experience. A week later, I received an unexpected visitor. Jess appeared at my door on a Saturday morning, looking tired but more composed than she had at the restaurant. She asked if we could talk, and I invited her in for coffee, unsure of what to expect from the conversation. Jess began by apologizing for her betrayal of our friendship, acknowledging that she had known on some level that pursuing Ryan was wrong, but had convinced herself that her feelings justified her actions. She explained that Ryan had been incredibly skilled at making her feel special and chosen, and that he had gradually isolated her from her other relationships while making her believe that their connection was unique and profound. She also thanked me for my role in exposing Ryan's crimes, admitting that she was grateful to have learned the truth before marrying him, even though the revelation had been devastating. She said that she was beginning to understand how manipulative and calculating he had been, and that she was horrified by the scope.
She said that she was beginning to understand how manipulative and calculating he had been, and that she was horrified by the scope of his deception across multiple relationships. The conversation was awkward and emotional, with both of us struggling to navigate the complex feelings surrounding our damaged friendship. Jess wanted to rebuild our relationship, but she also understood that trust would have to be earned back slowly. I appreciated her apology and her acknowledgement of the pain she had caused, but I was not ready to simply pick up where we had left off before Ryan came between us. We agreed to take things slowly, maybe meeting for coffee occasionally to see if we could find our way back to some form of friendship. Neither of us had expectations about what that might look like, but we both felt that our shared history deserved at least an attempt at reconciliation. The betrayal had been real and painful, but so had the years of genuine friendship that had preceded it. Over the following months, I began to understand the full impact of our confrontation with Ryan. Sarah moved back to her hometown in Nebraska and started therapy to help her process the emotional manipulation she had endured. She sent occasional updates about her healing journey, and gradually her messages became more positive as she rebuilt her confidence and started dating again. Robert Morrison kept me informed about the legal aspects of Ryan's case. He had indeed left Colorado and was making his required restitution payments, though the amounts were smaller than any of us had hoped. More importantly, Janet Walsh had shared information about his crimes with law enforcement agencies in other states, making it much more difficult for him to establish new identities and target fresh victims. The most surprising development came 6 months later when Janet Walsh contacted me about a new case. A woman in Arizona had filed a complaint against someone matching Ryan's description and methods, and the local authorities were investigating whether it might be the same person. Apparently, Ryan had not learned his lesson about targeting vulnerable women, though his new approach seemed more cautious and small-scale than his previous operations. I provided Janet Walsh with all the information I had about Ryan's patterns and methods, hoping it would help protect his new potential victims. The thought that he might still be out there preying on unsuspecting women was deeply disturbing, but I was grateful that law enforcement was now aware of his criminal history and would be watching for his activities. My relationship with Jess evolved slowly over that same period. We met for coffee every few weeks, gradually rebuilding trust and rediscovering the friendship that had been so important to both of us before Ryan's manipulation tore us apart. The process was not always smooth, and there were moments when the hurt feelings and betrayal felt too fresh to overcome. But we both made genuine efforts to understand each other's perspectives and to acknowledge the ways that Ryan had manipulated both of us for his own purposes. Jess came to understand that my investigation and confrontation with Ryan had been motivated by a desire to protect her rather than to seek revenge, while I came to see that her betrayal had been the result of skilled emotional manipulation rather than simple selfishness. The healing process taught me valuable lessons about forgiveness and the complexity of human relationships. I learned that it was possible to forgive someone while still maintaining appropriate boundaries, and that rebuilding trust required consistent actions over time rather than just words of apology. Jess had to prove through her behavior that she was committed to our friendship and that she would not sacrifice it again for romantic interests. One of the most important conversations we had during that period involved Jess's decision to seek therapy to understand why she had been so susceptible to Ryan's manipulation. She discovered that she had some underlying issues with self-worth and abandonment that had made her vulnerable to someone who promised her the intense connection she craved. Understanding these patterns helped her make better choices in future relationships, and also helped me understand that her betrayal had not been entirely conscious or calculated. My own therapy during this period focused on understanding why I had stayed in an unhealthy relationship with Ryan for so long, and why I had been so reluctant to trust my instincts about his behavior. I learned that I had been conditioned by past relationships to doubt my own perceptions and to prioritize other people's needs over my own well-being. The experience with Ryan and Jess had been traumatic, but it had also been an opportunity to develop stronger boundaries and better self-advocacy skills. The professional consequences of the entire situation were more positive than I had expected. My experience investigating Ryan's crimes and coordinating with law enforcement had given me skills and contacts that proved valuable in my marketing career. I started specializing in crisis communication and reputation management, helping businesses and individuals navigate complex situations involving deception and betrayal. My personal life also improved significantly as I applied the lessons I had learned from the Ryan situation. I started dating again, but with much clearer boundaries and better instincts about red flags. The men I chose to spend time with were more honest, more emotionally available, and more respectful of my autonomy than anyone I had dated before. About 8 months after the confrontation, I met someone who would become important in my long-term future. David was an environmental lawyer who specialized in protecting natural resources, and he had the kind of integrity and transparency that I now recognized as essential in a healthy relationship. He was upfront about his past relationships, his career goals, and his personal challenges, creating the kind of honest foundation that I had never experienced with Ryan. David's approach to dating was refreshingly straightforward. He asked direct questions about what I was looking for in a relationship, shared his own expectations and concerns openly, and made it clear that he was interested in building something real rather than just having fun. The contrast with Ryan's manipulative charm was so stark that it initially made me nervous, but I gradually learned to appreciate the comfort that comes with genuine honesty. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, without the intense highs and lows that had characterized my time with Ryan.
David was consistent in his communication, reliable in his commitments, and genuinely interested in my thoughts and feelings, rather than just looking for validation and support. He also had his own established career and social circle, so he did not need me to provide financial or emotional resources that he should have been able to secure independently. The difference in how David and Ryan approached conflict was particularly striking. When David and I disagreed about something or encountered problems in our relationship, he wanted to talk through the issues and find solutions that worked for both of us. He did not get defensive or try to make me feel guilty for expressing concerns, and he was willing to acknowledge when he had made mistakes or handled situations poorly. Meeting David also helped me understand just how much emotional energy I had been wasting on Ryan's drama and manipulation. With David, I could focus on building positive experiences and working towards shared goals instead of constantly managing crises and trying to decode mixed messages. The relief of being in a healthy relationship was almost overwhelming at first because I had not realized how much stress and anxiety Ryan's behavior had been causing me, even during the supposedly good times. Jess's recovery from the Ryan situation followed a different but equally positive trajectory. She took several months off from dating to focus on therapy and personal growth, using the time to understand her patterns in relationships and to develop better instincts about potential partners.
When she did start dating again, she was much more cautious and deliberate in her choices, prioritizing emotional compatibility and shared values over intense chemistry or romantic gestures. The experience with Ryan had been devastating for Jess, but it also served as a wake-up call about the importance of maintaining her independence and her other relationships even when she was in love. She made a conscious effort to rebuild friendships that had been neglected during her relationship with Ryan, and she established better boundaries about how much of herself she would sacrifice for romantic partners. Jess also became involved in supporting other women who had experienced similar manipulation and betrayal. She started volunteering with a local organization that provided resources for victims of financial and emotional abuse, using her own experience to help others recognize the warning signs and seek appropriate help. Her work in this area became a source of meaning and healing, transforming her painful experience into something that could benefit other people. The legal aftermath of our confrontation with Ryan continued to unfold over the following year. Janet Walsh kept me updated on his compliance with the restitution agreement, which was inconsistent but better than we had expected. More importantly, the information sharing between law enforcement agencies had resulted in investigations into Ryan's activities in several other states, leading to additional charges and restrictions on his behavior. The Arizona case that Janet Walsh had mentioned turned out to involve a different person with similar methods, but the investigation had led to the discovery of Ryan's activities in Nevada, where he had been running another elaborate con involving multiple women. The Nevada authorities were able to build a stronger case against him than we had been able to develop in Colorado, resulting in actual criminal charges and a prison sentence that would keep him from targeting new victims for several years. Learning that Ryan was finally facing real consequences for his actions was deeply satisfying, but it was also sobering to realize how many other victims there had been in different states. Each new revelation about the scope of his criminal activity made me more grateful that we had taken action when we did, potentially preventing him from causing even more damage to unsuspecting women. The experience also taught me about the limitations of the justice system when it comes to crimes like fraud and emotional manipulation. Even with overwhelming evidence and multiple victims, Ryan had initially been able to negotiate a deal that allowed him to avoid prosecution in Colorado. It was only when he continued his criminal behavior in other jurisdictions that he finally faced serious legal consequences. This understanding motivated me to become more involved in advocacy efforts aimed at strengthening laws and resources related to financial and emotional abuse. I started speaking at workshops and conferences about the warning signs of manipulation and the importance of trusting one's instincts when something feels wrong in a relationship. My experience with Ryan, while painful, had given me credibility and insights that could help other people avoid similar situations. One of the most rewarding aspects of this advocacy work was connecting with other women who had experienced similar betrayals and manipulation. I discovered that there was a whole community of survivors who were working to support each other and to raise awareness about these types of crimes. Many of them had stories that were remarkably similar to mine, involving charming men who had targeted them for financial or emotional resources while simultaneously maintaining other relationships. Through these connections, I learned that Ryan's methods were not as unique or sophisticated as I had initially thought. There were apparently many men who used similar approaches to target vulnerable women, and the tactics were so consistent that experienced advocates could predict the progression of these relationships with disturbing accuracy. This knowledge was both empowering and frightening, as it revealed the systematic nature of this type of predatory behavior. My relationship with David continued to develop and strengthen throughout this period of advocacy and healing. He was incredibly supportive of my work with other survivors, and he understood why it was important for me to transform my negative experience into something positive. His own work as an environmental lawyer had given him experience with advocacy and social justice issues, so he understood the time and emotional energy that this type of work required. David also helped me process the ongoing revelations about Ryan's other victims and criminal activities. When I learned about each new case or investigation, I would experience a mixture of validation, anger, and sadness that could be overwhelming. David was patient and understanding during these emotional reactions, helping me maintain perspective and focus on the positive impact of my advocacy work rather than getting lost in anger about the past. About 18 months after the confrontation at the restaurant, Jess and I had rebuilt our friendship to the point where we could spend time together without constant reminders of the Ryan situation. We had both grown and changed significantly during the healing process, and our renewed friendship was actually stronger and more honest than it had been before. We had learned to communicate more directly about our feelings and concerns, and we had established better boundaries about how our romantic relationships would interact with our friendship. Jess had also met someone new, a fellow teacher named Michael, who was kind, stable, and completely transparent about his background and intentions.
The contrast between Michael and Ryan was as stark as the difference between David and Ryan, and watching Jess in a healthy relationship helped both of us appreciate how much we had learned from our painful experiences. The four of us occasionally spent time together as couples, and these interactions reinforced my appreciation for the growth that both Jess and I had experienced. We were both more confident, more assertive, and more selective about the people we chose to invest in emotionally. The four of us occasionally spent time together as couples, and these interactions reinforced my appreciation for the growth that both Jess and I had experienced. We were both more confident, more assertive, and more selective about the people we chose to invest in emotionally. The manipulation and betrayal we had endured had been devastating at the time, but it had also taught us valuable lessons about recognizing and avoiding unhealthy relationship patterns. 2 years after the confrontation with Ryan, I received a phone call from Janet Walsh with news that brought a sense of final closure to the entire situation. Ryan had been arrested in California for attempting to defraud an elderly woman out of her retirement savings, a crime that carried much more serious penalties than the relationship fraud he had been committing previously. The pattern of escalation in his criminal behavior suggested that he was becoming more desperate and reckless, which had ultimately led to his downfall. The California case involved evidence from multiple jurisdictions, including the information that we had provided during our confrontation in Colorado. Our decision to document his crimes and share that information with law enforcement had contributed to building a comprehensive case that would likely result in a lengthy prison sentence. Ryan would finally face real consequences for his actions, and he would be unable to target new victims for many years. Janet Walsh also informed me that several other women had come forward with information about Ryan after learning about his arrest, adding to the evidence against him and potentially extending his prison sentence even further. The ripple effect of our decision to confront him publicly had continued to grow, ultimately protecting protection for countless women who might have become his victims if he had been allowed to continue his criminal activities unchecked. Learning about Ryan's arrest was deeply satisfying, but it also brought up complex emotions about justice, redemption, and forgiveness. I felt vindicated in my decision to investigate his background and expose his crimes, but I also felt sadness about the waste of human potential that his criminal behavior represented. He was clearly intelligent and charismatic enough to have built a legitimate, successful life if he had chosen to channel those qualities in positive directions. The news of Ryan's arrest also prompted reflection on how much my life had changed since our original confrontation. I was now in a loving, stable relationship with David, who had recently proposed marriage in a simple, honest ceremony that was the complete opposite of the elaborate deceptions that Ryan had used to manipulate his victims. My career had evolved to include meaningful advocacy work that helped other people avoid similar experiences of manipulation and betrayal. Most importantly, I had developed a much stronger sense of self-worth and personal boundaries that made me less susceptible to manipulation and more capable of building healthy relationships. The experience with Ryan had been traumatic, but it had also been educational in ways that had ultimately made me a stronger, more confident person. Jess had experienced a similar transformation, building a career in advocacy work while also developing a healthy relationship with Michael. We often talked about how different our lives might have been if we had never discovered the truth about Ryan, and we both agreed that the short-term pain of that revelation had prevented much worse long-term consequences. As I write this story now, 5 years after that confrontation at the restaurant, I am happily married to David and actively involved in advocacy work that helps other women recognize and escape manipulative relationships. Jess is also married to Michael, and we have maintained our rebuilt friendship while also expanding our social circle to include other survivors and advocates who share our commitment to preventing these types of crimes. The legal consequences for Ryan continued to unfold, with his California conviction leading to additional investigations and charges in other states.
The last update I received suggested that he would likely spend the next decade in prison, giving his victims time to heal and protecting countless other women from experiencing the manipulation and betrayal that we had endured. Looking back on the entire experience, I am grateful for the courage I found to investigate Ryan's background and expose his crimes, even though the process was emotionally difficult and personally costly. The decision to forward his wedding announcement text to Robert Morrison had been made in a moment of anger and betrayal, but it had ultimately led to justice for multiple victims and protection for countless potential future victims. The experience also taught me valuable lessons about the importance of trusting my instincts, maintaining strong personal boundaries, and surrounding myself with people who demonstrate integrity and honesty in their actions rather than just their words. These lessons have served me well in all areas of my life, from romantic relationships to professional endeavors to friendships. If I could offer advice to other women who might be experiencing similar manipulation or betrayal, it would be to trust their instincts, even when they are being told that their concerns are unreasonable or paranoid. Manipulative people are skilled at making their victims doubt their own perceptions, but those gut feelings about inconsistencies and red flags are usually accurate and deserve serious attention. I would also encourage anyone in a similar situation to seek support from trusted friends, family members, or professionals who can provide objective perspectives on concerning relationship patterns. Isolation is one of the primary tools that manipulative people use to control their victims, so maintaining strong connections with others is essential for both emotional health and personal safety. Finally, I would emphasize that healing from manipulation and betrayal is possible, but it requires time, patience, and often professional support. The emotional damage caused by these experiences can be profound and long-lasting, but with appropriate help and commitment to personal growth, it is possible to not only recover, but to emerge stronger and more resilient than before. The story of my experience with Ryan and the confrontation that ultimately led to justice has become an important part of my advocacy work, helping other women understand that they are not alone in their experiences and that it is possible to take effective action against manipulative and abusive partners. While I would never wish such an experience on anyone, I am grateful for the opportunity to transform my pain into something that can help protect and empower other people. The text message that started this entire story, Ryan's cruel announcement that he was marrying my best friend, had been intended to cause maximum emotional damage and to demonstrate his power over both Jess and me. Instead, it became the catalyst for his downfall and the beginning of healing and justice for all of his victims. Sometimes, the very actions that predators use to try to maintain control end up being the evidence that ultimately destroys them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.